Hello, today our guest is Camilla Lee, a remarkable art critic and a competent expert on Kazakhstani artists. It is Camilla Lee who first introduced the amazing term Turkic romanticism to describe the art of the 60s generation of artists. Camilla, let's talk today about the generation which has become truly innovative. My first question in this connection is, what exactly did the pioneer work of the 60s generation of artists consist in, and what role their leader and ideological inspirer Salikhitdin Aitbaev played?
На самом деле это такой был очень интересный период.
It was really such an interesting time. Socialist realism was in full swing everywhere.
Во всех этих творческих.
At that same time, a new understanding of culture and Kazakhstani art was taking shape in the workshops of artists during their creative dialogues and discussions. It is the 60s generation who raised the question of what the new art should be like and how it should represent the national culture.
Это было принципиально. Собственно говоря, я думаю, что именно
It was essential. I think that it was at that time that this identification process was being hatched and obviously gaining momentum.
Самоидентификации, который с каждым годом все набирал и набирал обороты.
The first work exhibited by Aitbaev at the All-Union Youth Exhibition in 1966 in the Manege was the proverbial happiness.
Хрестоматийная картина.
It is a fairly well-known painting among many national art schools, more specifically in Central Asia.
Можно сказать, и в нашей, конечно.
What makes this work interesting? First of all, there is the keynote of socialist realism in it.
Эта работа интересна чем? Во-первых, с одной стороны, там есть тональность социалистического реализма.
What is socialist realism? As instructed by top authorities, socialist realism must be national in form and socialist in content. In fact, Aitbaev painted exactly in such a manner. The theme is totally national. It is social. Figured in the painting are workers, young people who have everything ahead of them. At the same time, this is a rather plastically expressive piece of painting, which for the first time in those days presented a new approach to the plastic figurative artwork of young artists. It was characterized by large forms, monumentality, laconicism, the locality of color, and a conventional landscape that can be endless, with some elements of everyday life in the distance. This painting created a sensation in the general context of Soviet youth art.
И эта работа произвела сенсацию в то время, вот, в общем контексте, можно сказать, молодежного советского искусства. Для Айтбаева, конечно,
Aitbaev, in addition to the fact that he was looking for his own individual language, relied on the support of those artists who were close to him in spirit, such as Gauguin in the first place. Then, in a later period, when he developed a cubic style, he tried to decipher the code of Picasso's work. He was so carried away by the construction in the spirit of Cubism, of plastic and pictorial forms, that he was immediately nicknamed Picasso by everyone around him.
Кубизма, пластических форм, живописных форм.
On the wall next to his apartment door, they would write Picasso.
Picasso.
Speaking about his artistic manner of those days, they would say, Aitbaev is again Picassoing. Nevertheless, all of his works, painted in this manner, preserve his individual creative manner.
Сохраняет его какое-то индивидуальное творческое.
In your opinion, what was the influence of the 60s generation in general and of Aitbaev in particular on subsequent generations of artists? Why was it Aitbaev who had become the leader of the 60s generation?
Наверное, он где-то в своих работах.
Probably by some of his paintings he had outpaced the search for new plastic forms that would happen in the future. One might say that already in all subsequent generations of the 21st century artists, Aitbaev is undoubtedly such an unsurpassed figure who was searching his own unique style, the eye with purely national trends in the plastic images of artwork.
В пластических образах живописи.
It is believed now that he had overcome all the obstacles that were set both by time as well as by the lack of understanding from his colleagues to some extent and by the disapproval of the older generation.
И неодобрением старшего поколения. И он продолжал.
No matter what, he continued to develop his understanding, his creativity, his author's position. And for all subsequent generations, he was that necessary figure which gave them freedom of creativity.
Необходимая фигура, которая давала им свободу творчества. И вот в этом поиске.
And this search, irrespective of the artist's style or the goals set by them, Aitbaev's example was absolutely inexorable. He gave them the opportunity to feel like absolutely free creators.
Возможность им ощутить себя абсолютно свободными творцами.
In the permanent exhibition of the Abelhanka State Museum of Arts, they always display one signature painting by Salikhitdin Aitbaev, in which his experimental tendencies are clearly manifested. It is interesting that after the artist finished this painting, it hadn't been exhibited for more than 20 years and was criticized while it was created. Tell us the story behind this piece. And by the way, why does it have two names?
Название композиции «Обед. Забрание бригады». Так?
Indeed. Initially, the title of the composition is Lunch, Work Team Meeting. This was the title given in the agreement with the Ministry of Culture, which Aitbaev signed.
3 месяца Aitbaev работал над композицией.
The rough draft was approved. For 3 months, Aitbaev worked on the composition and presents the work to the exhibition committee. Everyone is stunned. In the first place, the exhibition committee members, for some unknown reason, came to the conclusion that the plot of the painting is somewhat connected with the famous biblical story of the Last Supper. The exhibition committee members said, "What kind of Last Supper have you perpetrated?" Secondly, the character on the left at the end of the table is represented as follows. There is a glass of tomato juice in front of him. In the original version, there was a piece of bread, and the man was covering this piece of bread with his palm. So he was told that an ordinary Soviet person cannot hide a piece of bread from his comrades. He is simply bound to share this piece of bread with everyone.
Aitbaev был в ярости, его не поняли, но потом он быстро успокоился и сказал, что работает.
Aitbaev was furious, but then he quickly calmed down. He said that he would tear up the painting and would not paint anymore. He doesn't need the contract, he will return the advance payment and so on. But his friends persuaded him to continue working. The painting turned out to be interesting. Why? First of all, there is a kind of brotherhood of these people. It doesn't matter who they are, workers or they look like his friends who gathered at the Dastarhan in Aitbaev's art studio. Generally speaking, this human intercourse for the 60s was very important. Secondly, someone helped him redo. They added this glass, removed the bread. Almost nothing has changed. At the time, for some reason, it hadn't even occurred to any of us that this was Picassoism, or that it was unacceptable in the context of Soviet art. Because in general, the painting turned out to be very expressive, unexpected, in the style of youth art.
Действительно очень выразительный, неожиданный и совершенно вот в стиле молодежного искусства.
The 60s go down in the history of Soviet art as a period of Khrushchev thaw. Amazing historical transformations and, of course, Khrushchev's coming to power led to the fact that certain indulgences were taking place in the creative environment. The framework of socialist realism is not so rigid. Artists, creative individuals, have more opportunities for self-expression. Hence the name, the generation of artists of the 60s. This is evident not only in the visual arts, but in the theater, literature, poetry. All of this is filled with the spirit of freedom, creativity, experimentation. Young poets such as Rozhdestvinsky, Yevtushenko packed stadiums, huge centralized halls such as the Central House of Artists or Manege represent the art of 15 republics, 15 sisters. You can imagine how prestigious it was to represent your republic. What a tight selection took place. And in the mid and late 60s, Kazakhstani art is represented by a group of young artists led by the leader, inspirer, one of the brightest and charismatic representatives of this generation, Salikhitdin Aitbaev. It was exactly then that this amazing painting entitled Happiness was presented in Moscow. Happiness. I wonder, what is the meaning of this simple and at the same time complex concept? What is human happiness? The formula is essentially simple: to live in peace, to be in love, to love and to be loved, to engage in everyday work. This is what human happiness is about. To live in your own world, in your own home. Look at the painting. The artist, building his own formula for happiness, chooses unusual painting techniques. Large forms placing the main characters in the foreground of the composition as much as possible, local colors, emphasized silhouettes, making reference to the ornamentation of forms. It is interesting that the artist was able to find such pictorial scenic means that this work became not only a symbol of this generation. Today, this painting is among the most wonderful brands of our museum, the Abelhanka State Museum of Arts. Salikhitdin Aitbaev is passionate about Cubism. This manifests itself in both small and large forms as well as in such techniques that are either partially incorporated in the artistic composition or visibly dominated. It is clearly with the predominance of Cubism that the composition of his painting Camels is done, or Camels on Joly, which was created in the mid-70s. Pay attention to the way the artist paints these huge majestic animals, their calm stateliness, their tranquility and some state of absolute fusion with the surrounding world, a wholeness that is inherent in the ships of the desert. It is interesting that the very tendency of such geometrization of forms as a whole typical of the style of Cubism, as well as the desire to break the object into its component parts, and the attempt to show the object simultaneously from different sides, is all that artists Picasso and Braque were doing in the early 20th century. It is interesting that Kazakhstani artists fit these tendencies into the local national context. The very technique of painting using large emphasized brush strokes, which is literally molding the shape of these majestic animals, invariably refers to the style of Kazakh national carpets. So this tendency of connection with Kazakh traditional art, which is constantly and persistently promoted by the artists of the 60s, is present in this composition. And here, similar to other later works of Salikhitdin Aitbaev, a characteristic ultramarine color appears, which many art critics have nicknamed the ultramarine of Salikhitdin Aitbaev. 1992 is the year when the painting titled Untitled was created. A completely different approach and a different style are used here. It is more chamber-like, more intimate. The image of a loved one is important for the artist. This is the image of a traditional Kazakh woman in traditional Kazakh clothing, with a scarf wrapped around her head. She is sitting inside the ute. We can even see the diagonal crossing of the ute's kirige, lattice folding walls, against her background. Take note of how the style of the pictorial system changes. More generalized, quite bold, color planes painted in large strokes that are literally lining up the surface of the picturesque structure of the canvas. And of course the image of the woman herself, who is sitting calmly, her gaze directed into the distance and hands folded in her lap. This image is very close to the artist. And at the same time, the very complex color spectrum of this composition expresses the character of this woman. In other words, the artist understands that his task in creating the portrait is much more complex than in just conveying external similarity. This is about the inner world of a person, their day-to-day habits, and revealing the person as the artist knows her. This psychological approach to conveying the image is characteristic of many portraits of Salikhitdin Aitbaev. Not infrequently in Aitbaev's oeuvre, there is an appeal to interior compositions. Interestingly, the artist has a recurring theme of the shepherd's family inside the interior of the ute. He has created several variations of this composition, and two of them are part of our museum collection. We are looking at one of them now. It's interesting to know that the composition is based on a circular principle. Essentially, the group of people who are placed in a semicircle is repeating or echoing the circle itself, that is, the round interior of the ute. We know that a ute is a circular construction. The tendency towards round forms in itself is a search for the harmony of the world. It is because everything that unites people and is in balance and co-dimensionality, and which the artist is striving to find and express with the help of visual means, are present in this composition. In the first place, it is in the mutual positioning of the characters or family members as depicted in this painting. The head of the family and clan chief is tenderly embracing and protecting the youngest child in the family. The mother is solemnly and regally seated in the center. She is also leaning over her child. All of this is in a unified relationship with the surrounding world. In this case, it is the main habitat of nomads, the ute. Interestingly, one can see that all the spiritual and moral values that artists have tried to find and reflect in their work are present here. To name some: respect for family, continuity that bridges the generations, transfer of knowledge or eternal love from the elder generation to the younger one. One more example of an interior composition is his painting in the studio. The artist here is addressing totally different issues. Unlike other works where the artist focuses on a person, in this painting the sitting model is not the main character. Rather, it is more important for the artist to show the creative environment where works are born. In general, it makes you think about the profession of an artist, because on the one hand it is a happiness to be chosen to create works of art, but on the other it's a heavy cross to carry. This is about the torments of creation, which is hard work that goes on round the clock. It is because truly creative people cannot live outside of art, cannot help but create. The artist is using an unusual composition in this painting. The entire interior is built on the intersection of diagonal lines with many sharp corners, intensifying it. This tension is further strengthened by a local bright red spot which is filling the canvas. Maybe incomplete, not even started, this bright red color could be borne by the rays of the setting sun. But this tension, which is present in the painting, is also filling the artist's soul. This is what fills his life, his creativity, and his destiny.